Snapping Branches, written by Yahoo Wahoo number 1. You can find a link to the author's story in the description below. I don't like people much. And due to a slew of personal reasons, most people don't like me either. To punctuate exactly how much I don't like being around others, I just recently purchased a new house so completely out of the way that my nearest neighbor is at least 1.5 miles from me. That's right, just me and nothing but the animals and trees in all directions. Now, a lot of people would call me crazy for living out here like this. If some disaster were to happen, I'd pretty much be screwed. I know. But I'm at a point in my life where I don't think I care much about that. Well, I thought I didn't. I'm such a fool. Having left the town I previously lived in at about 7 in the morning, it was at least midday by the time I finally hauled my beat-up truck and the few possessions I owned up the curving path to my new abode. Like a monstrous serpent of earth and gravel cut right through the dense pine forest, this driveway was about 1/3 of a mile long in itself, and full of so many rocks and potholes I was sure I'd get stuck. But due to some miraculous stroke of luck, I managed to avoid having to call a tow company. The trees and greenery finally fell away to reveal a clearing with a modestly sized cabin near its center. I stepped out of my pickup, slamming the door behind me and causing a few birds to scatter from their nearby hiding spots among the thick and tangled pine trees. With gravel crunching underfoot, I walked around to the back of the truck and began unloading. Now, I said I didn't have many possessions. This is true. Regardless of this fact, it still took me about 6 hours getting it all unloaded. The furniture was the hardest part. Darn near broke my back dealing with the armchair. But like I said, I don't do company well, and this includes people for moving assistance. I groaned aloud as I stretched a bit, wiping sweat from my brow as I cast my gaze up toward the setting sun. It was a loud cracking sound that echoed deep from the woods. Must have been really loud, because it was plenty audible even at such a far distance. Freaking serious tree branch right there, I said to myself as I looked in the direction it had seemingly come from. The forest was so dense that visibility fell off at around 50 feet, being replaced with gnarled branches and darkness. Didn't help that the sun was halfway down, causing eerie-looking shadows to stretch across the lawn toward my house. Regardless of all this, I focused my gaze on the spot intently. A deer? Bear, maybe? At some point, I realized I'd been holding my breath for some silly reason, letting out a long exhale. Just when I was turning toward the steps that led to my front porch, I heard it again. Another resounding that sprang from the dark of the woods. I whirled around to face it, but again nothing was there. Jumping at twigs now? I asked aloud, chuckling as I finally peel my gaze from the forest and walk into the cabin, shutting the ornately carved wooden door behind me. Standing in the entryway, I looked around my new home with a grin. It really was a nice place. Had that old rustic feel to it that resonated with all the classic mountain home vibes I'd been searching for. It'd even been given some pretty modern appliances, had some nice motion floodlights on the outside as well. And I got it all for what was practically a steal. Admittedly, I didn't feel like unpacking too much after all that heavy lifting, so the majority of my possessions would remain in this room for now, standing up against the wall in neat stacks. I slipped my work boots off and moved on into the kitchen to make myself some dinner. Well, dinner being a couple cups of ramen noodles and a beer. I realized with a groan that I'd have to go into town for some groceries. Eventually. I went ahead and unpacked the TV and an old rocking chair, setting both objects down in my new living room so I could watch one of the many crappy B movies I'd brought with me. I was a sucker for goofy horror stuff. I threw open the window next to me for some of that cool air and started digging into my ramen. I felt like I just about jumped out of my clothes when I heard it. Another snapping branch in the woods. But this one was closer? Yes, it was definitely closer. I settled back down in my chair, but my eyes were once again glued to the forest. Why was this setting me off? The woods were full of animals and sticks. It wasn't weird to hear a few snap now and then. Regardless of my attempts at telling myself how ridiculous I was being, I still gazed out the window. It was darker out there now, so I was even less likely to see anything. It was then that I realized just how quiet it was. Not counting the loud branches, I mean. Not a bird call to be heard. Maybe they were sleeping, I thought. But why hadn't there been any crickets chirping? I'd started to feel a headache build up in the back of my skull, sweat on my brow despite the cool air blowing in through the window. Okay, enough of that then. I'd said aloud as I got up from my chair with a grunt, promptly shutting and latching the window. I'd started to wish that I'd brought curtains with me. Figured I wouldn't need any this far away from anyone else, but now? I felt exposed. Vulnerable, even. But the old .22 rifle I'd brought up here with me did provide a bit of comfort. I started back on my meal that had begun to cool. Guess I'd been looking out that window for longer than I thought. Sometime later, I'd cleaned up and gone down the hall to my bedroom. It was about 10 p.m. now, and a glance out the window showed only an ocean of blackness. It was one of those moonless, starless nights that made you feel like you were out in space. By now, my headache had grown considerably, and I felt like I'd needed the help of my medication to get any meaningful sleep. Yeah, the meds are related to my issues regarding other people. Gulping a sleeping pill, I climbed on into the bed that this cabin had also come with. The mattress was surprisingly a lot more comfortable than I thought it'd be, too. Wouldn't be long before I'd drift off into another one of those long, dreamless sleeps I was so used to these days. Not long at... Up I sat, looking around left and right. But what greeted me wasn't the cozy walls of my bedroom. In all directions stretched nothing but dark, silent woods. If it hadn't been for the lantern, I wouldn't have been able to see anything. Where'd this lantern even come from? Stabbing through the nothingness like a knife was that darn noise again. I didn't know what to do. Panic had begun to grip my insides like I was choking on freezing water. I had to get out of here. I had to run. No, darn it, no. I let out as I began my frenzied dash through the forest. Branches reach out from all sides like skinny clawed hands, ripping at my clothes and skin. But I couldn't even begin to care about my physical state at this time. I knew I just had to get out of there. Behind me, another one of those awful snapping sounds chased me from the dark as it drew closer. What? What was even out there? Darn it, what was it? My head felt like it was going to burst, and I was absolutely covered in scrapes and cuts. I almost fall and split my skull open on a rock I didn't see, but caught myself at the last moment. The noises were increasing in frequency and volume, I realized. It was getting closer. Tears stung my eyes as I cried out into the darkness, as if this would stave off the futility of my situation. But just when I thought all hope was lost, I broke free from the woods into a familiar clearing. Yes! Yes! I yelled. I'd made it home. I just have to get inside. Just have to. What I see in the clearing isn't my house. With the dim light my lantern provides, I see a tree. A massive tree. The trunk stretches high into the sky, and its many leafless branches look like the arms of some sort of colossal upside-down insect, its twisted legs attempting to pluck the very moon from the sky. I'm transfixed by the sight, absolutely dumbfounded. The horrible sound from mere feet behind me had pulled my mind back into focus. But I knew it was pointless to run now. I stood there, rooted to the ground, just like the tree before me. I didn't want to see what it was. Like the mere sight of it will cause me harm. I refused to turn around. I just wanted it to be over with. Clenching my hands into fists, I shut my eyes tightly, waiting for the white-hot pain of an early death to tear through me. Then I woke up. Drenched in sweat, I opened my eyes to see the ceiling in my room. Oh, darn it. I'd said with a croak as I practically threw my sheets off of me. Rolling out of bed, I staggered into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of ice water. It felt so good, soothing my raw vocal cords. Had I been screaming in my sleep too? Those meds were supposed to keep that from happening, I thought as I rubbed my hand down my face. And why did that dream feel so real? That tree. I felt like I'd seen it before. It finally dawned on me after a few minutes of silent contemplation. I turned toward the back door, opening it after more hesitance than I probably needed. The backyard was expansive, surrounded by woods on all sides except the one facing my house. A few small trees dotted the lawn here and there, but smack dab in its center was a gigantic tree stump. The thing had to be at least 10 or 11 feet wide by my count. I'd seen this in one of the pictures that had advertised the house on the website I found it on. Apparently most of the wood that made up the cabin came from this thing. I walked across the lawn, letting the cool morning air soothe my still very warm body until I stopped a few feet away from the stump, looking down at it. Well, this stump was certainly a lot more dead than the tree in my nightmare, but the width of it seemed spot on. Having such an awful dream on the first night in my dream house seemed par for the course with my luck. I turned and trudged my way back inside, but not before taking one last look at the woods toward the very back of my yard. It was midday after an uneventful morning passed, and I decided that maybe I would just bite the bullet and head into town for those groceries. And curtains, I grimly reminded myself. The whole way there, I just kept looking into the woods on either side of my path, and when I rolled over a branch, the snapping noise it caused darn near made me swerve off the road. Those darn woods. I took a breath to calm myself. Just a dream. You'll love it here, I said. The drive took about 40 minutes or so total, but I could probably cut the time down after I remove all those rocks and fill in the potholes. The transition from dirt and gravel into pavement marked my arrival into the small pocket of civilization that was the town. Toward the center was the small shopping center that pretty much held all of the business here. Found myself a parking spot and went inside. I walked through the sliding doors of the grocery store, past the only employee stationed at the checkout area. Looked like an older woman, her hair tied up in a messy gray bun. She had thick glasses that really gave her an elderly librarian sort of look. I hoped to God she wasn't chatty. After about 20 minutes of walking around on old and yellowed floor tile, I amassed a fairly decent haul of items. I figured it was time to check out, so I turned and started down the somewhat claustrophobic aisle when a snapping sound from behind caused me to come to a dead stop. Here. There's no way. No way. Just no way. I hear myself choking out. I whipped my head around so fast it could have broken my neck. But to my intense relief, I just see another employee. He was using a box cutter to break plastic straps that held a box closed. I stared for a moment before a laugh slipped its way out involuntarily, causing the guy to look my way in confusion. Realizing I probably looked crazy for doing so, I promptly turned and walked the rest of the way to the front. The elderly woman behind the checkout counter offered me a smile, and I did my best to return the gesture. But it just felt awkward and forced, as usual.
Haven't seen your face before. New in town?
She asked me. Inwardly, I groaned. Yup, there's the question. I attempted to answer her as cheerfully as I could muster. Just moved in yesterday, actually. She nodded as she continued to scan my items. I wish she'd scan them faster. She spoke up again.
I can always tell. I got an eye for faces. Whereabouts are you located anyway?
I blink a few times. Moved into a place up the dirt road. The new cabin, I said before my brain knows what it's doing. Why did I say all that? Could have just made something up. Well, she was just some old lady anyway, I figured. I broke out of my train of thought when I realized she'd fixed me with a strange expression, her prior demeanor having melted away. She would then wordlessly hand me my last bag, and I took it from her, confused. Had I offended her somehow? Typical. In the end, I let out an awkward half-laugh before opting to leave with a quick, goodbye. The drive home was done in complete silence. Upon getting home, I began to hurriedly throw curtains up over all the windows. I tried to tell myself it was just for the sake of privacy, but that was a thinly veiled excuse at best. Only after blocking my view of the forest completely did I prepare dinner. I put on some music and even sang along to it, trying to block out any other potential outside sounds. More time passed, and it was eventually 8 p.m. The sun was well into setting. I could see only a faint bit of light slipping in from between the curtains in my living room. I sat down into my armchair that I'd unpacked a few hours ago, sighing and watching some of that mind-numbing TV. At some point, I guess I'd slipped into an unwanted nap, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake once again by the TV I'd left on, I'd so conveniently decided. Looking at my watch, I saw it was 12 a.m. Great. I'd ruined my sleep schedule with a 4-hour nap. With a groan, I rose from my chair and fumbled my way down the dark hallway to my room. I'd figured that after last night, I should try 2 pills instead of 1 this time. This way, I'll be out like a light for sure. I'd taken both, slipping into bed and rolling onto my side to see my now curtained window through the gloomy darkness of my room. 20 minutes pass, and I'm really starting to feel those pills taking effect. That familiar fuzzy feeling in my brain was setting in, and My drooping eyes open wide, bloodshot. My gaze is locked on the window. It was out there in my yard. I just knew it was. I fought with my reluctant body, commanding it to rise from my bed and walk over to the curtains. I had to know. If I knew, I'd stop being so afraid. It's just a stupid wild animal. Just an animal. Just an animal. Just an animal. I whispered as I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek through. It was dark out there. Dark enough that the meager moonlight only allowed vague silhouettes to reveal themselves. Had to look around and around for a moment before I finally spot it. Toward the center of the clearing stood a familiar shape. A deer? No, a bit too big. I decided that it's an elk, but it was just so hard to see that all I got was a dark elk-shaped blob. I could make out its tall, lanky legs and its huge set of branching antlers that sprouted atop its head. I sighed in relief, grinning to myself for being such a baby about all this. I'd begun to look away when another snap from outside caused me to turn back around in confusion. What was it stepping on to make those noises? I cleared my yard pretty well this morning. I continued to watch it curiously, but I could feel those pills taking effect more and more with each passing second. After about a minute of watching the thing, it finally dawned on me. Didn't I have motion lights? Why weren't they on? Actually, had this thing moved at all since I started watching it? I attempted to swallow, but my throat was dry. I kept watching it. Another minute passes, then 2 more. Please. Just freaking move. Please. I said, hopelessly. But it just stands there in the dark like a statue. Like something fake. Gosh darn it! Why wasn't it moving? It was wrong. Everything about this was just so wrong. A noise catches my attention. A soft creaking noise coming from the elk. The thing. It grew in intensity until its antlers. Its freaking antlers. They twitched, then cracked and shifted like those insect-like tree limbs I'd dreamt of. Like someone breaking an arm out of place in multiple angles. Like the antlers shift again and crack again a few more times. I shut the curtains quickly to block it from view, but the memory of it is burnt into my mind. It was dark in my room. It didn't see me. It couldn't have seen me. Please, God, don't let it have seen me, I thought. I just end up sitting there on the floor under the window, panting and sweating, waiting for something to happen. But even with this fresh fear coursing through me, I could feel those pills fighting to put me under. Staring up at the clock on my bedside table, I started counting the passage of time. 12:30 a.m., 12:45 a.m., 12:50 a.m. I'm finally out at around this time, I think. But I have that same horrible dream, and I woke up screaming in the morning, again. From my very uncomfortable spot on the floor, I was relieved to see that there was light streaming in through the curtains. I got up, stiff from my unfortunate sleeping location, and threw them open to reveal an empty backyard with that massive stump at its center. That thing was standing on that stump, wasn't it? No, it wasn't, I stubbornly thought. There wasn't anything there. That was all just some sleeping pill-fueled hallucination. This whole thing has just been in my head, like everything always is, I tell myself. What an idiot I was. Regardless of how much I tell myself it didn't happen, I only went outside once to get the mail at the end of my driveway. Otherwise, I was shut up in my cabin, with the music blaring. I really liked this music. I dug out some books that I hadn't touched since buying. I put on a movie, only to realize halfway through that I'd watched it the day I moved in. Something kept distracting me. The thought of that thing I saw through my window. But I just as quickly reminded myself that it wasn't possible. This was reality, not some nightmare. The worst things in these woods were bears, and even then they wouldn't go out of their way to kill you. My attempts at reassuring myself were useless, and I could feel my anxiety growing as the hours slipped by. At around 6 p.m., I decided to shower, and I stayed in there for about an hour. Yeah, a hit to the water bill, but I really needed it. I actually did feel a bit better afterwards, too. Slipping into bed after changing, I sat there in silence. I figured that I'd forego the sleeping pills, to prove to myself that all of this was just the side effects of some faulty drugs and I'd end up getting a lot of money for financial compensation or something. Yeah, they were supposed to keep me from having crappy dreams, but the last two were worse than anything I'd ever dreamt before, and I wasn't about to go through that a third time. I stared at the clock, watching the time tick forward and internally on high alert for any totally not real noises. But I didn't hear anything. Only the usual forest sounds of crickets. I slid further under the covers and let sleep take me, for better or worse. Why hadn't I just taken the darn pills? I woke up, startled awake by rapid thumping footsteps coming down my hall. It was here in my freaking house. How? I just kept asking myself how as I scrambled toward the edge of my bed, toward the wall that had my .22 mounted on it. But it was too late. My door flew open, but what stepped in wasn't the thing outside my window. It was a man in dark clothes. Yes, someone had broken in. I froze in my tracks as I noticed he had a gun pointed at me. "Don't move!" He yelled at me, and I flinched from the volume. I complied, remaining stationary. "Look, I don't have much to steal, I tried to say, but I'm cut off by another scream from the intruder. "Shut up, or I'll blow your brains out!" Come here! He gestured to me with the weapon, and I reluctantly did as he commanded, walking towards the open door. Why was my luck so crap? I get over these nightmares just to be confronted with a very real situation like this. He'd forced me out ahead of him, into the adjacent living room down the hall. Stand right there, he said, and I did so. I stood there silently for almost 15 seconds. What was this? Was he thinking about what to do with me? A sharp blow to the back of the head with his gun answered that question. I fell to the floor, hitting my head again on its cool surface. The whole world just started spinning. Had my eyes on this place for a few days, he told me, walking around my crumpled form. I could feel a warm trail of blood running down the back of my head from where he'd hit me. You should really start locking your doors. Darn it! I'd been so scatterbrained yesterday I forgot even that much? This jerk had really taunted me about it too. Couldn't he just steal all my crap and get it over with? He had been about to hit me again, I think, when it happened. That noise. It came suddenly and loudly. Even in my dazed state, I could feel the fear bubbling up. My attacker apparently heard it too, which meant it was real. It had always been real. What was that? He asked aloud, looking down to me. You got someone living here with you, huh? I shook my head as best as I could manage, but another from outside drew his attention again. Yeah, you do, freaking liar, he spat out at me. He angrily marched his way down the hall, wood creaking under his shoes as he barged out through the back door and into the darkness, bellowing loudly. Hey! Don't move or I'll shoot your The motion sensor lights snapped on like they were designed to do. They hadn't been wrongly installed, or faulty, of course. The only wrong thing in this situation was that thing outside. From my angle on the floor, I couldn't see the man anymore. Just the illumination cast into the room by the bright lights outside. I heard the dumbfounded confusion in the man's voice, his absolute lack of understanding at what he no doubt saw standing in the middle of my yard. What the... was all he managed to get out. Then, the screaming began. First in terror. Sheer, unadulterated terror. I heard him running back to the house, screaming like that the whole way. The snapping and cracking was maddening. Like whatever out there was excited to see that pitiful man. A shark-smelling blood is what came to my mind at the time. His screams shifted almost instantly to those of agony, and he began to beg for his life. The sound of his voice was being rapidly moved from place to place outside, as if he were being thrown about by some great force. I struggled with all my might to get to my feet, and finally did so. Moving down toward the open back door, I had to fight against all my instincts that were telling me to flee right then and there. As I reached the door, I shut my eyes. I didn't want to see it. I thought I did before, but now I knew without a doubt in my mind that I absolutely must not see it. A few warm droplets splash across my face right before I slam the door shut, locking it. I turned and frantically sprinted to my front door, the door that would-be robber had probably come through. Finding it unlocked told me this hunch was true, and I promptly locked that door as well. Turning again to my back door, I only then realized that the screaming from outside still hadn't stopped. It had actually grown more intense. I could hear vague words and phrases. His pleading had devolved into what sounded borderline deranged. He apologized over and over to his dad, his mom, others I could only assume he knew. At one point, his screaming turned into hideous laughter, only to return to screaming minutes later. Even when blood filled his lungs, even when his vocal cords were shredded, he kept screaming. Why wasn't he dead? How wasn't he dead? I felt absolute sorrow for this man, and he'd beat me over the head and tried to rob me only minutes earlier. How can I most accurately describe the sounds he made? Maybe like a guy who'd fallen into a wood chipper feet first, but if his death was played out in slow motion. The man outside my house screamed like this for an hour and a half. I know this for a fact, because all I could do the whole time was stare across the room at the clock on the wall. What else could I have done but sit and listen? The snapping noises of the thing outside and what I assumed were the man's bones being broken just blended together. Finally, mercifully, the screaming tapered off into a pitiful gurgling whine. And then silence. I sat there. I just kept sitting there, not moving. Not even to get up and clean my head wound. I sat until the sun had long since risen, and when I finally got up, it felt like my body was made of jelly. I walked to the bathroom, looking into the mirror. What had felt like warm rain on my face when I'd been at the door earlier was made out to be speckles of blood that had long since dried. After frantically cleaning it all off in the sink, I left the room, then looked to the back door. Walking to it made me feel like I was on the moon. Everything was in slow motion. This couldn't have been real, I pointlessly thought. I finally pushed it open after what felt like a million years had came and went. It had been real. It had all been real, of course. What I saw, I'll never forget. All the drugs in the world won't dull that scene. Strewn about my yard was the man. Yes, I'm sure that was him. All over the place. The grass was stained red, and looking to the side of my house revealed it was painted a similar color. There was meat everywhere. Organs, fractured bones stabbed vertically into the earth. But the bones were so white, so clean. I doubled over and puked up the remnants of last night's dinner. Warm bile and snot coated my mouth and nose and left me choking for breath as I sputtered. Raising my head again, I noticed something else in the middle of all this carnage. The tree stump had grown into a tree again. It was alive again. Significantly shorter than the one in my dreams, but still definitely a tree. In the twisted branches of that tree hung the man's intestines, draped from branch to branch like fleshy power lines. Across the front of the broad, dark trunk, facing my house, lay his skin, It had been so intricately removed from his body that I could practically see the expression of frozen agony on its stretched face. The day went by in a blur, and it's almost night again. I don't know what to do. I can't call the police about this. What do I tell them? That someone broke into my house and then what? They carefully disassembled themselves and posed their body parts in my backyard? This is the kind of thing people get executed for, I imagine. My track record isn't the best to begin with. I decided it was best to just clean it up, to hide it all and pretend it never happened. It's hard getting several meters worth of guts out of a tree, especially when you stop to puke every 5 minutes. And I'll need to buy a power washer for my walls. But I realized something else while I was out there cleaning that jerk up off my lawn. And this horrible thought only solidified into truth when I heard the increasingly close snapping of branches out in the woods a few minutes ago. That tree doesn't look like it's finished growing yet.